So let's remind ourselves, the title of Alemann's film quotes, of course, the revolution of Karl Marx's famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And this focus, the focus on the necessity of change, is endemic to von Alemann's film, and I would say to her work in general. And it is also endemic to this panel, more generally. And after watching Claudia von Alemann's film, you might have begun to suspect why it is that this panel is called Revolutionary Senses. Because what connects it with all three presentations to come is that they specifically, be that in filmic or poetic form, question and expand an understanding of the capitalization of the human senses. In von Alemann's film, we witness a machinized gender binary, an industrial form of labor in which femininity is characterized by the extreme construction of minute motor activities identified as female. And we hear the women speak about how they advocate these identifications as skills, as qualification, and as potential. And I will now briefly introduce all three papers and its authors in their order of appearance before I give them the stage. In Anke Hennig's paper entitled A Reading from Salt and Sugar, Cinema's Contribution to Comparative Revolutionary Studies, we will return to the original anchor point of the Haus der Kunst, Specters of Communism, the Russian Revolution, and the filmic productions emanating from it. Hennig will look at two films by the Soviet-Georgian filmmaker Mikhail Kalatozov, namely I Am Cuba from 1962-64, and his earlier Salt for Svanisha from 1929. In what Hennig calls comparative revolutionary studies, she will discuss those two films in the light of the modes of perception they engage the viewer in, how techniques of human life and technologies of human reproduction are dramatized in them. While the first one uses the form of the documentary to engage in an ethnographic study of Phoenician village life by its forms of labor, the second one uses narrative structures to expand this understanding into a notion of labor as human metabolism, not relegated to work. Anke Hennig is a theorist of the 20th and 21st century literature and visual culture. She's a visiting professor at the University of Arts in Berlin and is also teaching at Central St. Martin's in London. She's chairing the international research group, Retro-Formalism, and is the co-founder of the transnational research platform Speculative Poetics. She holds a PhD from the Peter Sondy Institute of Comparative Literature at the Free University of Berlin and has been, amongst other things, a Fulbright Fellow at New York University. Recently, she co-authored a manuscript, Salt and Sugar, Cinema's Contribution to Comparative Revolutionary Studies, together with Rachel Moore, from which she will read to us. She's also the author of Soviet Cinematic Dramaturgy, which was published in German in 2010, and in cooperation with Armen Avanesian, co-author of Present Tense, Apoetics of 2012, and of Metanoia, Speculative Ontology of Language of 2014. Hennig has published a large number of articles and also anthologies that discuss different aspects of Russian cinema, poetics, prose, and culture before and after the Russian Revolution. So, who could be more equipped to start off this panel? The second speaker is Claudia von Alemann, who, as we know by first-hand experience now latest, is a documentary and feature film director, author, producer, exhibition curator, and film professor. She studied art history and sociology at the Free University Berlin before taking up film studies in 1964 at the famous Hochschule für Gestaltung Ulm, the Ulm School of Design. Between 1968 and 1969, von Alemann lived and worked in Paris, where she directed the documentary This Is Only the Beginning, The Fight Will Continue, on the film collective États Généraux du Cinéma of May 1968. In 1973, together with Helke Sander, von Alemann initiated and organized the groundbreaking first International Women's Film Festival in West Berlin, and from 1982 to 2006, she taught as a professor for film at the Fachhochschule Dortmund. Von Alemann has co-authored the book Das nächste Jahrhundert wird uns gehören, Frauen und Utopie in Frankreich from 1830 bis 1848, and published in magazines and anthologies such as Frauen und Film, Medium, Kursbuch und Das neue Kino. She's a long-time member of the European Film Academy in Berlin, has received numerous prizes at international film and video festivals, and taught at film schools in Havanna, Cambridge, New York, Boston, Montreal, Geneva, Grenoble, and London. Von Alemann has a daughter and lives with her husband, the Cuban film director, Fernando Perez, in Cologne and Havanna. Her latest documentary film, Die Frau mit der Kamera, Porträt der Fotografin Abishai Thülmann, was nominated for the Hessen Film Prize in 2005. Relating back to what we just saw, von Alemann's paper entitled On Questions Pertaining the Historical and Contemporary Significance of Revolutionary Practices Within the Field of Visual Arts and Film, I love that title, we look at the significant paradigm shift that the 60s and 70s represented within both the arts and everyday life, especially for women. Von Alemann will engage in a discussion of the direct actions taken up by women to enable and further the process, and at the role feminist festivals, such as the just aforementioned in West Berlin, played in that. After Hennig and von Alemann, our third speaker, Bonney, will engage in another revolutionary sense. From sight and touch, we here turn to sound. In his paper, emblematically entitled The Chorus is on Fire, Bonney will discuss the appearance of static, of interference, of disturbing noises in the course of revolutionary actions, or those actions that make heard the inevitability of the present tense disruption. Bonney thus opens up our view onto the present for a perception that registers such cracks within the normalized everyday as openings to another dimension, another sense. Something that is not utopian in itself, as it does not calm the mind with the outlook to a reconciled life, but that tears into the known in anticipation of its intolerability. Bonney is a poet and researcher based in Berlin. He received his PhD from Birkbeck College, University of London, and his selected poems, Letters Against the Firmament, were listed as one book of the year by Verso in 2015. Previous publications include Notes on Heresies of 2002, Poisons, Their Antidotes, 2003, The Commons from 2011, Happiness, Poems After Rimbaud, 2011, and the essay collection All This Burning Earth of 2016. Bonney has a blog, which you should all read, which is entitled Gods of the Plague, and is currently working on a book to be titled Crisis Poetics, funded by the Dahlem Research School at the Freie University of Berlin. As my own starting point in entering the questions of Specters of Communism today has been the Russian prolet cult and its attempts to revolutionize all forms of human life, to engage in a cultural revolution that leaves no aspect of life untouched. I could not be happier than having those three speakers on the first panel. One last thing, a personal note. I was very happy to be invited by Oqui and Visor to be one of the conveners of this festival. It allowed me to bring together people who not least I myself want to see in dialogue, and whom I think are instrumental to discussing the arts as the potential locus of radical change today. A radical change that is not nostalgic, not even for art. Those people are here not primarily because I invited them, but because Damien Lentini has been so engaged, tirelessly and thoughtful in coordinating, well, in organizing us, which is nothing short of a revolutionary skill. Thank you.
I also want to thank Kerstin Stakemeier for putting this panel together and giving me the opportunity to present excerpts from a manuscript that I have written with Rachel Moore on cinema's contribution to comparative revolutionary studies, where we look on Salt for Svanetia and I Am Cuba by Mikhail Kalatozov. I hope somebody can switch on a PowerPoint where I will show you just in an automatic order stills from both films in case you don't know them. In pre-revolutionary times, the people of Svanetia traveled perilous distances from their villages at the highest reaches of the Caucasus for one of the life's essential elements, salt, mined in distant plains. In pre-revolutionary times, the peasants of Cuba's plantations cultivated and cut cane to grace tables all around the world with sugar. Survival is sweat and drudgery, something must be done. A revolutionary road to cut through the impassable mountains, a revolutionary march from the Sierra Maestra, so end Mikhail Kalatozov's legendary films Salt for Svanetia and I Am Cuba. These simple tales of progress, filmed some 30 years apart, often leave audiences dumbfounded by their all-out visual excess, which jars with their message on many levels. By thinking with and through this excess, rather than past the seeming ornamental force, we argue for a rereading of these masterpieces by one of the 20th century long underappreciated directors. We contend that what at first appears as irreconcilable in the relationship between script and film, or between revolutionary language and excessive vision, proves instead a telling paradox that animates both the films and our analysis. Insofar as they show landscapes from a pre-globalized world, there's something prehistoric about Salt for Svanetia, made in 1929, and I Am Cuba, made in 1964. For our post-utopian times, there's also a strangeness in their revolutionary pathos. Their distance in space and time notwithstanding, for today's cinephiles, these two films are intimately related to each other. Their first audiences encountered these films in the realm of national cinema, and this largely accounts for the original and contemporary debates about their value. That was denied. Their sustained appreciation flourishes now that they are no longer open to comparison with the places to which they refer. I Am Cuba is no longer challenged by Cuban audiences who claim proprietary rights over their own representation, and its beneficial influence on the progress of Cuban cinema is now recognized, however begrudgingly. Since the film's re-release in 1997, its avant-gardism has continued to excite. Likewise, re-released soon after, Salt for Svanetia's avant-gardism aroused similar excitement, with its severe camera angles, contrast montage, and dramatic close-ups. Their surreal quality comes from the way the films look. It's not just that they are black and white. The high contrast seems to take a further remove from realist aesthetics. Another estranging factor comes from the places where they were made, which most audiences would not have visited, except Claudia von Alemann. The films, therefore, appear to have an ethnographic function as panoramas from a pre-global world. Cuba and Svanetia were both places of revolution, worlds that attempted change. The two films were meant to give form and meaning to their need for transformation. But both the films and the revolutions failed in significant senses. The films were abundant because of their formalism. Cuba did not establish socialism. Svanetia is no longer a socialist country. And the road over the mountains from Russia was never completed. While there have been political and military shifts over the years, these sides look at all intents and purposes just as they did when the films were made. For all the revolutionary verve, these are places where nothing much has changed. Like the films, they remain in another dimension of time, outside of history, each frozen at the long ago instant of change, at their decisive moment of revolution. Their preservation in time serves them as they now thrive largely through tourism, the one for its beaches and revolutionary lore, the other for its ski resorts and tribal folklore. What these quite different places share, or that these quite different places shared a similar future, is perhaps coincidental, but the excess that emerges in the films has an uncanny resonance. While one film highlights scarcity, the other abundance, they share an aesthetic of extremes. Caught on the threshold of transformation, a limit marked out in Georgia, in Cuba, and in these avant-garde films, takes on a ghostly or spectral life on its own. As the films progress towards revolutionary limits, man and nature, for example, or woman and death, each time they reach a limit, it's not overcome, but transgressed. Instead of chronicling change, the films provide a record of avant-gardist form trapped in historical dialectics. Now not only knowledge of historical events, but also shifts in how the visual operates and form the different position from which we understand these films today. Thus, the contemporary viewer is not as invested in the accuracy of these reenactments of revolution as she is in viewing them as documents of artistic experimentation. It's almost as if the entirety of historical materialist thought has been raised in today's viewing. Just as there are things that we can see that contemporary viewers did not, there are things today that we cannot see because we don't share their historical experience. The script for Sold for Svanetia was written by Sergei Tretyakov, the famous author and theorist of the Russian avant-garde. He wrote books such as Denshi Shwa, A Literary Study in Factography, and the influential biography of The Thing, that championed a radically materialist literature. The world-renowned poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko and Cuban Prize-winning author Enrique Pineda Barnett, again deft hands in navigating political, ideological, and aesthetic concerns, wrote the script for I Am Cuba. The quality and reputation of these writers helped to gain the space for making these films. Tretyakov was an exceptional professional scriptwriter with well-honed savvy in dealing with the shift from written script to resulting film. To say that they knew how to write a good script means that they understood censorship machinations. They knew how the censors, who as possibly is known also were writers, thought. But more importantly, navigating censorship meant they could write what was only apparent to avant-garde's eyes. In a process that became more and more laborious, the scripts underwent heavy scrutiny, but the films did not. As we experience their texts and their images, the films exceed the story told and the ideological message delivered. The literary texts escape censorship as the films transgress their contemporary visual canon, such that viewers criticize them for their extreme formalism. In a certain sense, they also transgress their historical moment. That their taboo-breaking gestures find a different, more receptive audience today implies the need to go beyond an historical approach to find an anthropological as well as an archaeological angle to understand their full force. How have we changed that we react to them so differently today? And then there's something at work in transgression itself, something that searches for a limit only to embed secrets, secrets that compel our attention once again. Under the rubric of transgression, in our book interrogates the shifting limits between technology and the individual. As technology drives the communist anthropological machine ever forward, these films feature human fragility. Following the revolution, the Soviet Union of the 1920s took a massive leap forward toward the dominance of mass media and rapid modernization. The idea of the new man as technological animal featured prominently in the initial industrial surge, creating a situation that can be used as paradigmatic for the ever-expanding place of technology in our society today. That combination of the technological and the human, which configured the electric atom of the Soviet era, reforms again today with the term post-human. It is against this constellation that Kalatozov set his revolutionary account of the animal in the human. his version of nature re-emerges today as highly relevant to several critical discourses which share the question of how to redeem the animal. Our book devotes a chapter to each film. Chapter 1, on Salt for Svanetia, pits the account of the necessity for a revolutionary change against the film's transgressive imagery to tell a quite different story. Tretyakov presents the Svan people as caught in a cyclical world that historical materialism's progress needs to change. Nearly everything that happens in the film is earlier reported in his written sketches of the area, which paint a picture of a place preoccupied with death that suffers from both material and social deprivation. Although one recognizes the narrative pattern of progress, none of the usual suspects, neither politics nor history, seems to play a major role. Instead, the forces of revolution move on the more basic terrain of natural history. Historical materialism here has to be understood in its most basic sense, which inevitably prompts the question why salt is revolutionary. One explanation lies with Sergei Tretyakov, who in his theoretical writings had argued for the revolutionary power of things and materials in themselves. He was famous for speaking out against an idealistic composition of the novel, centered on heroic characters and their revolutionary or counter-revolutionary actions, in favor of exploring the objective power of materials and processes. I quote, "Books like wood, metal, grain, coal, iron, flax, cotton, paper, locomotive, factory have not been written." Shortly after, he published his advice for the future of Georgian cinema in the local newspapers. I quote, "Further on, the cinema of Georgia should go the productivist way. Manganese, tea, silk, tobacco. All these need to be given form in a script." The story told by the film is very clear and accomplishes the task of beckoning the swans into the modern world so that history can begin. The film's imagery works against the story at every key moment. Even the final set of triumphant images, where the hybrid figure of an animal and machine emerges to lead a gang of workers clearing the way for the road, has seditious qualities. We create a narrative from the various eruptions that occur when the images overwhelm that smoothly beaten path to progress. Chapter 2 of our book tells the story of the many changes that took place as I Am Cuba evolved from script to film. The writer, the cinematographer, and the director each engaged with revolutionary Cuba differently. But they also had different biographies as regards the Russian Revolution. Survivors of the Russian Revolution that led to totalitarian terror, Kalatozov, the director, and Urusevsky, the cinematographer, arrived to witness a second revolution in Cuba. For Urusevsky, that meant a full-on visual assault deploying military infrared stock, a handheld camera that slashes through Cuba like a machete, and a godlike mastery of light. Even his shadows work as constructivist art. Kalatozov, on the other hand, reluctant to see or experience anything of Cuba, was mournful, melancholic, and, as has been often said, frequently in tears. While Yevtushenko sees only repetition, he says they already had the Russian system, Kalatozov can actually remember, and this process of memory takes the path of mourning. What has been lost may never be clear, but the loss itself finally receives its required expression with this film. Their varying attitudes created such ambiguities that the film becomes a series of suppressions that are strategically camouflaged by formal maneuvers. The film operates with a mechanism of taboo, whose function here is to rebury unearthed secrets, most notably death, especially the death of women in revolution. One of the clearest questions posed by viewing these films is the difference between their initial reception and ours today. We question not only how we have changed to make us view these films differently, but also what kind of way of seeing, in a certain way, a difference in our senses we gain from this comparative approach. To pursue this question, we interrogate our changing relationship to technology, to the animal, and to history. Now, when all of Kalatozov's films are available to view, they reveal meanings that could not have been seen during his career. Particularly striking are the many instances in which Kalatozov approaches the death of vision. Kalatozov transfers that vision into something useful, not just for him, but also for us, as he creates a way of seeing adequate to a truly revolutionary world. In tracing what we can now make of these films, we look backwards at them, but more importantly, we look forward from their particular position in history to complete the reciprocity of vision the films set out for us so long ago. From its inception, our book had the subtitle, A Contribution to Comparative Revolutionary Studies. On the one hand, this situated our inquiry within the sphere of revolution rather than aesthetics. The other impulse was a bit more speculative, because comparative revolutionary studies does not yet exist. The subtitle also suggests a methodological formula for contemporary theoretical practice, which says, should you find yourself doing research, be sure to make a place for it to go. Inventing a discipline that does not exist yet doesn't just temporarily free research from the reifications of existing disciplines. More importantly, naming a possible discipline as the theoretical horizon for study creates the possibility of a hidden reward, just as a prospector thinks of salt in distant mountains or sugar in distant lands. While working, we came across Hannah Arendt's book on revolution, discovering with surprise what could indeed be comparative revolutionary studies foundational text, which compares the French and American revolutions. We don't compare the Russian and the Cuban revolutions in order to extract the essence of revolution, as Arendt so eloquently manages to do. In frequently quoting the Russian revolutionaries in order to compare the French and the American movements, her work embodies a form of spectatorship. We adopt her multi-layered concept of spectatorship that is at work in planning, staging, and experiencing revolution. It's no coincidence then that spectatorship was such an important subject for theoretical speculation for Soviet filmmaking. What may well be a coincidence, however unlikely, is that Hannah Arendt wrote the book during the time that I Am Cuba was being made, as she never mentions the Cuban Revolution of 1958 in her book. Arendt has witnessed a revolution so recent that its qualities were not yet established. Revolution was not just in the air when she wrote the book, but immediate and urgent. Rather than speculating on the possibility of revolution today, we follow Arendt, Kalatozov, and many others who see it as their task to tend the idea of revolution with a care sufficient to sustain its spirit. Thank you.
Yes, first of all, like the others, I would like to thank the Haus der Kunst, his director Okwi Envetor, and especially the admirable curator Damian Lentini, and his team, and the chair of our panel, Kerstin Stakemeier, for inviting me to contribute to it. I'm also extremely grateful that my film from '73, The Point is to Change It, had been digitalized on the occasion, digitized heißt es, glaube ich, and provided with English subtitles, making it now available for a bigger audience, as so far only a very old and torn 16mm black and white print had been in distribution, so that the film had more or less fallen into oblivion and wasn't shown anymore since about 40 years. I quote my favorite Monty Python collective, who always said in their television series, "And now something completely different." At the end of the 68s and the beginning of the 70s, the 11th Feuerbach thesis by Karl Marx, the philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, served as a guideline to neglect theory in favor of direct action. As member of the SDS in Frankfurt, an acronym of Sozialistischer Deutscher Studentenbund, I joined in the late 60s the Autonomous Women's Association, the so-called Weiberrat, an ironic and political historical allusion to the male-dominated revolutionary councils in Germany and Russia, which became very quickly a major feminist organization residing in almost every West German town. We started in September '68 at one Mitgliederversammlung of the SDS in Frankfurt, but then this first Weiberrat diminished quickly, but then we founded the second Weiberrat in January '70 in Frankfurt, and it soon became from 5 to 10 women, an association of about 200 women, and as you must know, in almost every West German town there were founded women's groups. Within the environment of universities, that is in cities like Berlin, Frankfurt and Munich, collectives of various left-wing groups emerged, focusing on factory work, Fabrikarbeit, and thus following the then trend-setting recognition that workers, men and women, were the revolutionary subject of social change. At the same time, since the mid-60s, along with the rise of feminist movements, especially in the USA, France, Italy, Germany, England, and the Netherlands, the so-called consciousness-raising groups emerged, where topics were discussed that today seem to us self-evident: pregnancy, abortion, contraception, domestic violence, gender equality, and gender pay gap, for instance. The increasing employment of women in industry and their mostly miserable workplace conditions and precarious pay have been linked to demands such as wage for housework. Lohn für Hausarbeit was a big campaign, not shared by everybody, but very much in conflict with certain groups. Campaigns and demonstrations provided for a broader public, attracted media interest, and thus led to a corresponding politicization. The aim of these actions was, in particular, to overcome the division of labor between the sexes through the socialization of domestic and reproductive labor. The liberation of women was thus at the center of the struggle of a largely non-dogmatic yet militant feminist leftist movement in Europe and the United States. Women like Betty Friedan, Feminine Mania, Kate Millett, Sex and Dominance, Shulamit Firestone, Women's Liberation and Sexual Revolution, Sheila Rawbotham, Women's Liberation and the New Politics, and other books, Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch, Simone de Beauvoir, Evelyn Sulero, A Woman in Modern Society, or Maria Rosa da Costa, The Power of Women and the Overthrow of Society, of the Potere Operaio in Padua. Later, in '71, Lotta Feminista, were famous pioneers of this struggle. The Power of Women and the Overthrow of Society, which she co-authored with American-British feminist Selma James, was a manifesto on the role of housework in capitalism and first-person politics. First published in '72, it fuels the feminist discourse worldwide and was published in '73 in German translation by the legendary Berlin publishing house Merve as a collective work by comrades of the Berlin Women's Center. From this basic text, the campaign Wage for Housework developed in England, Italy, and West Germany. It's maybe known to you all, but if I repeat myself, I don't know which age the public is, welches Alter die Zuschauerinnen hier haben und ob sie das alles bestens wissen. A short excursus to our Women's Film Festival, the first International Women's Film Festival in West Berlin in '73, the same year I did this film in the Cinema Arsenal in West Berlin, together with my friend and colleague filmmaker Helke Sander. At that moment we invited 300 women of different status, especially militant women from women autonomous groups and women of media, print media and television, etc., because both groups used to hate each other and to have incredible prejudices against each other. So we wanted to reconcile these two different enemy groups. And so we had about 300 women and about 5 men also joined us. And during 4 days we showed 40 films, more documentary films than fiction, and all these films had to deal with women's issues made by a or several women and women's issues, and not Leni Riefenstahl doing, well, you know what I mean. So these films all dealt with women's issues, and we had researched them during 9 months, Helke Sander and I, in different countries like France, England, Sweden, and invited some women directors, but not very many because we didn't have the money to invite more. But so we had 4 days of incredibly intense discussions, film showings and meetings, and also a Women's Journalist Association had come into being, which is still existing today. My share is controlling me. Kerstin. So my documentary, Es kommt drauf an, sie zu verändern, from '73, is a result of all these considerations which I have said before. It has set standards in the context of the reorientation and re-evaluation of the image of women and the role of women in the late capitalist patriarchal society. With the slogan, the private is political or the personal is political, we created new fields of debate and also created various experimental forms of direct action or interventions in public space. We shot in several factories in the Federal Republic. We, my cameraman, the filmmaker Dietrich Schubert, my assistant Mischka Popp, today herself a very well-known documentary filmmaker, the feminist social scientist and university professor of sociology Christel Eckhardt, and myself. I'm also the sole producer of this low-budget film, financed with an award I received for an earlier film, yet without any television participation. And of course, television never bought this film because the aesthetics of this film were not corresponding with what television thought the public could stand. The shooting was extremely complicated and stressful, as we had to constantly hide our real intentions of shooting the film. Usually at that time it was totally impossible, if not even forbidden, to shoot in West German factories. The management of the companies was usually not much interested in publicizing the poorly paid female jobs and disclosing the deficient working conditions of women. It took me a sort of feminine Wallrafiade. You know that Günter Wallraff is a well-known author, filmmaker, and journalist who investigated in factories and other places, disguised, for instance, as a Turkish worker in order to denounce their poor working conditions. So I also didn't disguise, but I pretended with the false letterhead that I was belonging to a sociological institute which did exactly the opposite, which wanted to show the good conditions of women in factory and the wonderful management. So I lied and lied and lied, and got a special makeup and bought a special bought special clothes for this masquerade. And so to get the necessary shooting permissions by faking alleged topics and other intentions. In some factories, I got no permission at all, as I could not reveal my real intentions to the working women whom we were filming in the factory, as we were constantly monitored by an observer, a representative of the plant who accompanied us while filming, with our 16mm camera and recording, at that time very impractical and disrupting, the sound recording wired to the camera, which now for young film students it's almost unknown. I was obliged to speak with other workers from outside the factory, whom I got to know through intense research within the circuit of unions and leftist factory groups, which eventually meant that we met in the living rooms, as you can see, in their Wohnzimmer with their plants and their cushions, which mit dem Knick drin, in order to communicate unobserved by their capitalist factory owners. And you have certainly seen or heard in the end of the film that the worker who talks mostly, that she, of course, is lying to us, and of course we knew that, because she knew all the actions her comrades or her colleagues wanted to do, but she could not say that openly. She had to pretend that she didn't know it, of course. It was Evelyne Sullerot, the French sociologist, feminist author, and former resistance fighter, who died in March 17 at the age of 92, who wrote in one of her pioneering publications at that time, The Emancipated Slave from 72. In many cases, it can be said that an activity turns to women only when it loses value. A job in which income and prestige diminish for some reason, perhaps because it has become automated or outdated, is more or less waged by women. Evelyne Sullerot has also pointed out that occupations in which women are more likely to invade are losing status, or that women can only reach certain positions when they are no longer respected. We finally managed to do some shooting at the Adlerwerke in Frankfurt, Main, which was until '98 had been producing office machines, in particular typewriters. And also, for instance, in the Lights Optik in Wetzlar, and which produced the very famous, for every filmmaker and photographer, very famous Lights Optik, still one of the most famous objective photo or film objectives. And at BBC, Mannheim, Brown, Bovary, and C, which produced washing machines and this kind. At that time, I was exclusively concerned with jobs in the metal industry, because women there had to perform the particularly monotonous or extremely stressful, for instance, lights, optics, and lenses for photographic and cinematic cameras, and extremely difficult piecework, Akkordarbeit on the assembly line, activities that were generally attributed to women, as women more easily adapt to them than men, quotation. My concern was not only to criticize the considerably lower pay of the female workers, but to analyze and visualize the much more advanced specific forms of women's work, and those in industrial women's jobs where men did not work anymore at all. For that, I spoke over a long time span with female workers, IG Metall trade unionists, and left-wing sociologists. The education department of the IG Metall union originally planned to distribute the film, and of course I would have liked that, but then rejected it because the 3 female workers of the BBC Mannheim criticized them very vigorously. So they refused to buy the film and to distribute it, which was bad. Nevertheless, the film was used very often and very successfully in different contexts. It has been in distribution by Arsenal Berlin and other distributors within the cinema circuit. It was represented in the women's film rental, and it was Oh, I have to stop. And it's, well, it was distributed very widely, and at that time, late 60s and the 70s, filmmakers like me were widely traveling and showed and discussed intensely with all kinds of groups and organizations with the big film Büchse unter dem Arm. And in this case, the discussion with groups has been very often extremely aggressive. For instance, the question arose, why does no man talk in the picture, but only women? But also, in my case and that of many other friends, the aesthetics of documentary film and cinema altogether played a decisive role, being influenced by direct cinema of US American filmmakers, but also by our professors of Ulm School for Design, Edgar Reitz and Alexander Kluge and others. We adopted a strict or puristic, sometimes too didactic, I must say, aesthetic, which, as could have been expected, didn't find the approval of the television programmers at all. Fixed settings, also feste Einstellung, no movements, no unnecessary pan shots and travelings, denial of intercuts or sometimes very rough cuts, jump cuts. The cinematographer and I agreed on endless, strenuous plan fixe, also feste Einstellungen, without any camera movement in order to get an almost physical feeling of the unbearable monotony of these movements. As I already communicated earlier, the point was not only to ask unionist demands as equal pay for equal work, as already equal work for men and women did not exist any longer. So the point was to denounce the ideology that female workers are less prone to monotony and more apt to work at the most monotonous and dirtiest work. The point was to change it, not only to interpret it differently. The point is to radically, my point is to radically question the organization of work, in this case of factory work for men and women altogether. Though, of course, within these 44 years, from 93 to today, industrial work has very much changed. So I come to the end. I would like to end with a quote by Stefan Hessel, diplomat, politician, survivor of concentration camps, who recently died and who says, "Time for outrage. Indignez-vous, empört euch."
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. What I'm going to read is kind of a draft of an essay that's going to be at the end of a book of poems that will probably come out next year. It's called "The Chorus is on Fire," and it has an epigraph from the poet Amiri Baraka. I mean, who the fuck are these bastards to kill all of us? Self-righteous motherfuckers who don't believe they're gonna die. This is specific to Britain, and it's about loss. It's about the Britain of a few years ago, when a resurgence in working class politics, mass student demonstrations and anti-police riots up and down the country took their place alongside what seemed like the beginnings of an international rejection of neoliberalism. It's about a Britain where a demonstration come riot could end with people surrounding a car containing a couple of senior royals chanting "off with their heads." It's about how that wasn't even particularly surprising. And it's about how the subsequently reality seems to have convulsed. We've all blinked, and Britain's been transformed into the cringing, silent, fearful and racist hell world it appears to have become. In the opening paragraph to Nina Power's introduction to the anthology Bad Feelings, which was put together by a bunch of radical art activists in the years when we attempted to register the scale of our defeat, she says this: "It has to be admitted that we have lost, if not quite everything, then nearly. But we were never so naive as to think that we would win. The struggle continues, but it cannot do so without the admission that we have been and continue to be hurt time and time again. The sense of collapse that follows every high, vivid political movement, for example, the 2010 protests and occupations or the 2011 riots, leaves us bereft. And if you don't feel like you've failed enough already, there are trials, harassment, and prison to remind you to weaponize time. For some, many, every day is a continual exercise in the external construction of failure by the state. You will never win, and we will remind you of this every day, every time we stop you in the street, every time we refuse you benefits, every time we push you around and make you feel even more like a loser. I wrote a poem a few months ago which deals with the same kind of thing, which is called "What If the Summer Never Ends?" None of us have slept for a long time. How could we? There were fires up and down the Charing Cross Road, mumbled conversations about apartheid. England was damp, was possibly leaking. We followed tiny trails of liquid waste across the city, called it aesthetics, called it action. We all fell down. Some of us voted, some of us put on balaclavas. There were several earthquakes, endless strategies of tedious indifference, some major buildings and some statues defaced, declarations of endless war, parties in the park, criminalisation of drinking, several dead friends. There was experimentation with makeup and electricity, occupation of a number of universities, fist fights with cops and fascists, distress, hate speech, consolidation of royalty, running for our lives. It's difficult now. All of that stuff is piled up like a heap of expressionist rubble in a semi-imaginary alley somewhere far away. We argue endlessly about whether it was us who died or them, but the one thing we all agree on is the barbed line that separates us. Sometimes we pluck that line. It makes a high and barely audible electric screech like some useless old record. It puts immense pressure on the inside of our skulls like boiling bleach, like the abolition of all memory. It speaks of heartbreak, of denial, of new advances in somnambulism, of revenge fantasies and drug addiction. It has nothing to say about where to go from here, about the day we crawl out from under our scattered rocks and burn their border controls to the ground. One day our eyes will close. One day the sun will finally go down. That high and barely audible electric screech is whispering the phrase "the struggle continues" that Nina Power finds to be at the centre of our long and sober contemplation of the fact of our loss. I'm interested at the moment in what's inaudible and what's incomprehensible. To take one example, it's incomprehensible that only a few years ago, a few of us were standing at a burning barricade in Piccadilly, London W1. The signals from that memory are faint, are damaged, are barely audible. To take another example, at the end of Pasolini's theorem, the patriarch, having given his factory away to the workforce, whether or not they are willing to accept it is left ambiguous, takes off his clothes and wanders off into a strange volcanic landscape. As he does this, he screams. Or rather, he emits an inhuman and unearthly groan as he passes from one register of reality to another. In simple terms, I guess, it marks him moving from the land of the living to the land of the dead. I would say the meaning of this groan, this scream made by a pitiful member of the bourgeoisie suddenly becoming comprehensible to himself, is actually communism. If we live our lives under lies, it becomes difficult to see anything if it does not have anything to do with those lies. Amiri Baraka wrote that in 1960 when he was still the bohemian poet Leroy Jones, fresh from a trip to Cuba to see firsthand what had happened in the revolution. The things that are difficult to see are the things that are incomprehensible to the terms of reality delineated by those lies. Think of London, unable by now to comprehend even the most basic of the lies it has been telling about itself, and like any of us, very far from knowing any longer what is the opposite of a lie, non-cognitive aspects of the city. A city lacking memory, visibility, audibility, or history. A city defined by racism and debt, extending backwards and forwards into history. A place that could have been described by Frantz Fanon, as he wrote at the beginning of Black Skin, White Masks, there is a zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an utterly naked declivity where an authentic upheaval can be born. That is, the zone where the pitiful groan of an utterly naked representative of property can become the excited yelps of a gang of rioters as they run into a smashed-up shopping mall, all yelling, "Let's go shopping." The teenage rioters of 2011 weaponized shopping. It's not a question of countering capital's lies with some kind of ahistorical revolutionary truth, but of weaponizing those lies, weaponizing the fact of our loss. Fanon, in 1959, wrote of the menaced lie, that which potentially can blow the whole system to shreds. He wrote about this in the remarkable essay, This is the Voice of Algeria, a piece that reads at times like a piece of Afro-surrealism long before that term became a commonplace. He writes of the battles for ownership of information during the Algerian War of Independence, tracing the unexpected results of the colonizers' attempts to jam the radio broadcasts of revolutionaries. Imagine groups of insurgents gathered around a radio, attempting to listen to clandestine radio broadcasts being constantly jammed by the signals of the authorities. There's a quote, a fairly long quote. Because of a silence on this or that fact, which, if prolonged, might prove upsetting and dangerous for the people's unity, the whole nation would snatch fragments of sentences in the course of a broadcast and attach to them a decisive meaning. Imperfectly heard, obscured by an incessant jamming, forced to change wavelengths 2 or 3 times in the course of a broadcast, the voice of fighting Algeria could hardly ever be heard from beginning to end. It was a choppy, broken voice. From one village to the next, from one shack to the next, the voice of Algeria would recount new things, tell of more and more glorious battles, picture vividly the collapse of occupying power. The enemy lost its density, and at the level of consciousness of the occupied, experienced a series of essential setbacks. It was the power of the enemy sabotage that emphasized the reality and intensity of the national expression. By its phantom-like character, the radio of the Mujahideen, speaking in the name of fighting Algeria, recognized as a spokesman for every Algerian, gave to the combat its maximum of reality. Non-cognitive aspects of the city. Fanon calls it a piercing, excruciating din. Revolutionary information comes through as static and phantoms. It's the gaps in the communiques that provide the psychological strength necessary for resistance. The choppy, broken voice, even when inaudible or broken into by enemy disinformation, is a marker of something existing outside the network of official lies. Static, even more than clear communication, is the negation of the imposition of silence on the part of the occupying forces. Listening to the broken broadcasts, the revolutionaries are forced to complete the information given within their own imaginations, to conjure themselves as living phantoms. It meant making a choice between the enemy's congenital lie and the people's own lie, which suddenly took on a dimension of truth. The intensity of the enemy's attempts to jam the signals exerts pressure upon the people's lie. The fantasies of revolutionaries, cut off from real events of struggle, and so cast back upon imagination, allow access to something else, the truth of resistance itself, cast in purely abstract terms. The beginnings of revolutionary struggle became a battle between absolutely incompatible and incomprehensible systems, cosmologies, played out in the obscure shapes of static, interruption, and sabotage. Put it another way, a short story by Amiri Baraka, The Screamers, tells of a riot in a rhythm and blues joint in Newark, New Jersey, sometime in the late 50s. He describes the sounds that the saxophones make, the repeated rhythmic figure, a screamed riff, pushed in its insistence past music. It was hatred and frustration, secrecy and despair. There was no compromise, no dreary sophistication, only the elegance of something that is too ugly to be described and is diluted only at the agent's peril. Ethnic historians, actors, priests of the unconscious. That stance spread like fire through the cabarets and joints of the black cities, so that the sound itself became a basis for thought, and the innovators searched for uglier modes. A basis, perhaps, for the thinking of that which cannot be thought or described. That is to say, I've given 3 examples of impossible audibility: the scream of the naked factory owner, the phantom-like din of the illegal broadcast, the hatred and despair communicated by music in the process of becoming something other than music. And I say they're impossible because it's now a commonplace to say that it's impossible to live in London, and yet people continue to do just that. Here's another miserable poem. It's called We Are the Dead. and it has a epigraph from Pasolini in an interview he gave on the day of his assassination. This is a different landscape. There is a desire to kill here, and this desire ties us together as sinister brothers of the sinister failure of an entire social system. Defeat is among us, and war and prophecy. That's a line from Muriel Rukeyser. I was thinking about it a couple of days ago, asking myself whether the words followed a sequence or whether they could only be taken simultaneously. That is, were they like marks on a calendar, or were they a kind of cacophony, a form of sky, an enormous black sky at that, in which we are all basically like halos or pinpoints or stars, and so would like to be destroyed? There were no simple answers to questions like that. To try and find one, I walked up to Sebastianstrasse, and I roamed up and down for around 3 hours, screaming Rukeyser's line over and again until my voice began to fall apart. Luckily, there was no one around, because in the third hour things began to go wrong. Rukeyser's words had started to become weird shreds of impossible meaning that once spoken could never be repeated, because once they had been spoken all else would disappear. The sky was a hoax, the stars were border guards, etc. I held my hands in front of my face and could see nothing but a bland white light, like a murderer's mirror, a vicious and impassable glass. Not glass, a gaze. Not a gaze, a glare. Not light, but prophecy. A word that for the past few months I've only been able to associate with surveillance, with cameras and with judges. Why? Well, if you have to ask, etc. Put simply, prophecy implies a prediction of the future via excessive and possibly aberrant interpretation of all available elements of what we like to call the present. And who are the current powers that survey and interpret the present to such an aberrant and excessive extent? It isn't poets, and it isn't mystics either. Anyway, whatever. I kept screaming, past all voice, all body, all of my borders. By borders, of course, I mean senses, and I thought at this point of Marx about what he said about the 5 senses, imaginary or otherwise, you know the bit I mean, and the cut that it implies in the sensory calendar. Because these days I very much doubt I can say with any certainty I have 5 senses. Certainly as I screamed out Rukeyser's line, it seems I only had 3. That's right, surveillance, cameras and judges. Actually, that's not 3 senses, that's just one. One enormous black sky, one enormous pit of cancelled language, one enormous voice rasping out one final incomprehensible sentence. And it was midday. It was very dark. There were no stars. I think the buildings were burning. There were a few of us there standing around outside them, inventing language. We were wondering if that bastard the sun was ever going to return and what it was planning on doing when it got here. We were talking about prophecy, about defeat and war, about how nobody knows what those words really mean and what they will come to mean. The events that took place in Britain between 2010 and 2011 continue to be important because of because of the incomprehensibility that has settled over them, so that they come to carry the same charge as the strange groans that have been going on about. Their meaning is in their lost. The draconian sentences handed down to the rioters, the royal pageants and Olympics that oversaw the privatisation of the space of the city. The choice the city gave you in the aftermath of the riots was luxury flats or prison. Space was privatised. Time was weaponised. The citizenry were criminalised. The aftermath settled in the weird bourgeois self-destruction of Brexit. If this seems esoteric, it's only because in the face of the loss we have experienced, to talk about communism is precisely to talk about the non-comprehensible, of what Hölderlin called the eccentric orbit of the dead. Traditional bases of organising are almost gone. That was Thatcher's great genius, to close the factories and to close resistance. The factories spread out into all aspects of social existence, and then it was closed down and converted into luxury flats. The scream of terror in the face of this is the echo of other ways of living, flickering just outside of sight. And remember, when Charles Windsor, Prince Charles as he likes to be called, goes to sleep, he can still hear the sound of anarchists screaming off with his head.
Okay. Thank you very much Thank you so much. A series of revolutionary moments, end of 20s, beginning of 60s, beginning of 70s, and the present. So, well, we've got quite a mass to maneuver here. I will start with the first question, and I will pose it to Anke, because we will lose Anke in 10 minutes.
I'm very sorry about that.
I'm just saying that so that you don't think she storms out. Maybe she will. We can have a look. One of the things I found really interesting is that I thought, like, in the end, like, all of your presentations were very much related to one another in the sense of what Claudia was talking about as first-person politics, what Sean was talking about as becoming incomprehensible, and what Anke was talking about in questioning who's the destined audience, or like how does one become the destined audience. And I mean the same we had with like form in film, form in language, form in organization. So my question would be, what do you think of this relation? Like, would you say our relation to past revolutions or our relation to revolutions that need to be actualized is actually a relation of gaining form? Of like, is it the question of how to become the destined audience? Like, how do we gain the form that makes us that?
I think in my paper and in quoting Hannah Arendt, the idea of becoming the destined audience or becoming a spectator of the revolution implies becoming a revolution. Mm-hmm. So one of the really interesting facts is that most of the quotes in Hannah Arendt's book about the French and American Revolution are from the Russian revolutionaries. So it's the revolutionaries who are watching revolution, it's the revolutionaries who are, how to say, draw conclusions from it. Mm-hmm. So I exactly did not mean it in, becoming a distant spectator. Mm-hmm. And therefore we also tried to develop a model of seeing that borrows a lot from John Berger's ways of seeing, where he claims that a revolutionary way of seeing requires a reciprocity, where it's not a single subject that sees something, but that any look has to be recognized and brought back.
So would you say that this kind of reciprocity relates to what Claudia, for example, called a first person's politics? And I mean, what Sean was talking about was also very much from a first person's politics.
That possibly is a difference to the other two papers, because it's rather a second person approach.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Yeah.
Than a first person approach.
Can you explain
about the second person?
Yes.
Okay. I believe theoretically it came out from studies of literature or the contemporary novel, that in developing modes of giving form to the present, as Sean tried, we found a type of novel that on the one hand uses forms in the present tense, but tries to split the agent of this present into at least a duality or a reciprocity, or at least a minimum of a plural. Maybe not a collective, but not a subject, not a singular person. And also with these films, I believe one can see that. So they are movements of groups, collectives, masses.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I can pass on that question to the other two, like relating back this first-person politics to the splitting of the first-person politics into a multiple-person politics. Does that relate to you?
No.
Can you say why? Or can you say something more about the first-person politics you were speaking about? Maybe I explain why I'm doing that. Why I'm doing that is not least because what you mapped out as a historical moment in which you shot the film, in which you then went on to discuss the films, and what you described as this very aggressive discussion is what I would see is very much lacking in those terms of discussion today. I mean, this form of aggression, and I think this form of this form of aggressive discussion, but I find it really interesting to think about how the film, like your film, which we saw this morning, can re-engage us in such a form of discussion. Because yes, it's a historical perspective, but if you think about how how female labor has changed from then till now, yes, it looks different. But it's not like the structure changed. So how can we, so this is why I'm talking about this, like, so you're speaking from a historical moment, but at the same time you're speaking as a very present tense problem. So this is why I'm going that way.
Yes, but I'm just at a moment of disillusion, disappointment. There's one film, I don't remember by whom, which is called Bleak Moments, and I have a bleak moment, not here, of course, but I have some bleak moments concerning history and concerning avancée, to get on, to get further. And when I saw this film after so many years again, I was very much moved. I was very much touched and moved incredibly by the development inside the film of these Arbeiterinnen, of these working women and union members who criticize the union and who get inside the film who develop inside during the film, though in their Wohnzimmer, in their nice rooms. I did not ask many questions. I was listening, but I did not ask questions, and I did not provoke them, and I did not criticize them, of course, because I liked what they were doing, and my role was to observe and to listen. And so I saw that they got more and more upset and angry, and their faces changed, and so I could hardly stop them. And I wanted to say that I was so much moved by this, seeing this again, that I thought in a very negative way of today. So, I mean, of course, I'm not a negative person, and I see a development, but especially concerning women's movement or changes or advantages, I see it in a very disillusioned way. But as we've just found it 2 years ago, the Regiequote, also the film directors and of course female technicians who've asked for the quota in film distribution and everywhere. Of course, we have done more things and advanced in a certain way, but I don't know if you understand what I mean.
It's like
it's a long story.
Like things changed, but then again they didn't, and like it's there are
so many backlashes that sometimes I get desperate.
Oh, sorry. No, couldn't agree more, and it's the perfect line to hand over to Sean.
No, but the discussion was, excuse me, after the film was not only aggressive, it was extremely positive also. And I regret that we do not do this. I'm not nostalgic, that's not the point, but I regret that we do not do this work with the Filmbüchse under the arms and project everywhere with very bad 16mm projectors and in bad rooms in which the linoleum fell off the wall, or so I regret without nostalgia, this direct contact to the public and to get angry and to do something with film. And of course later on we did a lot work with video and with developing video collectives and doing video and showing video everywhere and all these kind of activities which I could talk 3 days about. But I mean, this direct work with the metal film books traveling around, I miss that very much.
Mm. Again, it's, I mean, precisely a question of like how to gain form in a moment of defeat. I mean, like what is form then a moment of defeat?
I don't know. I mean, in terms of first-person politics, I mean, my involvement in whatever it was happened in Britain in 2010, 2011, it changed my writing. It changed the way that I appreciate other artworks. It changed my methods of teaching. In everything. What's peculiar though is it's past, and talking about. I mean, this is the first time I've sat at a table and talked about it really, and it's there's no nostalgia industry over what happened in Britain over 2010, 2011. I mean, it's kind of like vanished. I mean, hardly anybody talks about it. When you think about the intensity of the demonstrations, the regularity, the occupations of buildings. Anarchists running up and down Oxford Street, banks on fire and shit like that. I mean, it's almost like it's just some kind of dream, you know. I mean, it's just been completely erased, almost from memory, and definitely from whatever Britain's official account of itself is. I mean, in my writing now, I'm still trying to sort of like compute. And not just in Britain, but everywhere, this kind of sense of an uprising against neoliberal capitalism has suddenly just spun around into a resurgent far right, and whatever the hell is going on in Britain now. I mean, God, I don't even go there. You know?